Alrighty, that took me a little longer than I wanted. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and this week we're reading more of The Lazarus Effect by Frank Herbert and Bill Ransom. Previously on... Oh no, did I lose my bookmark? No, there it is. Previously on, let's see, Queets Twisp um, has picked up Iz Bushka from the ocean. And upon learning his story about how he was, oh, what's a good way to put it? Peer pressured, uh, coerced. He doesn't kill Guemes willingly. In fact, he tries repeatedly not to do it, but he's put into a scenario where he's given an offer he can't refuse, sort of. Um, At any rate, he is part of the group. He was in the sub at the controls when Guemes Island got sunk by said sub. So Queets Twisp, understandably, is kind of like, I don't know about this guy. But Mr. Twisp is kind of a good example of the idealized Islander mentality, which is you try to help people in need, and you trust people as much as you can until they've done something to screw you over. But it's generally a turn the other cheek because we're all in this together. Um, that's not really a spoiler at this point. It's kind of like that's kind of his character's role. He's going to have, and that role is going to change and evolve as over the course of the book. Let's see. So Iz Bushka is mostly in just a state of sheer self-loathing, but he's not really given up the whole "I want to be a merman" thing, even though realistically there's no real difference, which is a point that Ward Keel has brought up with Karine Ale. It's like, okay, if you truly believe that we're all one and the same, why did it take you so long to mention the fact that you are about to have land as a result of your experiments with the kelp and automated and communication with the kelp, using the kelp as a tool? And she doesn't have an adequate answer for that. She's like, yeah, no, we really, really should have gotten you in the loop a lot sooner. Um, and mea culpa, but like, that's why I'm telling you, is like, this, we can keep islands from running into land, but there's soon going to be a lot of land. A thing that is probably worth noting is that Pandora is pretty small. It is not a very large planetoid. Um, it's considerably smaller than the Earth. It might be on a par with our moon. Does this have... Uh, I'd have to pull out my copy of the Jesus Incident because that actually has a... Here, let me... Real quick, if I can grab that. Is that handy? Ah, there we go. So part of what makes, any added landmass kind of significant. Uh, so it's egg-shaped for starters. It is, call it, what's its diameter? If that map is to be taken as rote, and just assume it's a flat half sphere, hemi-egg. Where's the distance? 1,000 kilometers is about an inch. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. Call it a diameter of 5,000 kilometers, maybe. Going longitudinally around its belly, its equator. North to south looks like it's almost half again that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-ish. 6 or 7 thousand kilometers from North Pole to South Pole. So it's a relatively small rock covered in water. Um, If I had if I could find a digital copy of the Jesus incident that included those maps, I would absolutely have shown them during the Jesus incident and now. But it's why some of the drama actually is able to work. Is my point. Okay. I need to flip that book around. I'm going to forget to do that, but that's okay. Let's see what else is going on. Oh, yeah. So the survivors of Guemes Island, or the rescuees from Guemes Island, are now starting to pour in where Brett, Norton, and Ward Keel are at. And because they don't know the layout of the underwater base, they can't really help. Ward Keel can't help because he's old and falling apart and having a hard time. He feels his death is imminent. Brett Norton can't help out because he just doesn't know the surroundings enough. Um, Not for lack of desire to help, because obviously he wants to help. Um, but they're just having to sit it out while the mermen take care of it, which kind of makes them feel kind of crappy, to be honest. I think that's where we pick up, is with them, actually. We have a fair chunk set aside this week. Let's get through that and see, because then, yeah, call it 3 more maybe, including this week. Maybe 4. All right. Not to belabor a tired cliche, but without further ado, let's get rocking and rolling. Let's get this island floating. There we go. Yeah. Never trust a great man's love. Islander proverb. Keel looked down from the observation platform onto a nightmare scene of controlled pandemonium. Rescue sleds wallowed into a small docking basin, coming through hatches lining the far wall of the courtyard below him. This was no nightmare, Keel reminded himself. Triage teams moved among the human shapes that littered the deck. Trauma teams conducted emergency surgery. Trauma teams conducted emergency surgery on the scene while other survivors were carried or carted off. The dead, and Keel had never imagined that much death, were stacked like the meat they were against the wall to his left. A long oval port above the hatches gave a sea view of the arriving rescue sledges queued up and waiting their turns at the hatches. Trauma teams serviced these, too, as best they could. Behind Keel, Brett uttered a sharp gasp as the shreds of someone's lower jaw tumbled to the deck from a body bag in transit to the mounting pile of similar bags against the wall. Scooty, standing beside Brett, shook with silent sobs. Keel felt numb. He began to understand why Karine Ale had sent Scooty to fetch him and Brett. Ale had not really grasped the enormity of this tragedy. Seeing it, she had wanted Islander witnesses to the fact that mermen were doing everything physically possible for the survivors. And she'll bring up the dirty work of the dead, he thought. Keel glimpsed Ale's red hair among the medics working over the few survivors scattered across the courtyard. From the piles of dead, it was obvious that survivors were not even meeting the odds of pure chance. They were a tiny minority. Scooty moved up beside him, her attention fixed on the deck below them. "So many," she whispered. "How did it happen?" Brett demanded, speaking from beside Keel's left elbow. Keel nodded. Yes, that was the real question. He did not want to conjecture on the matter, he wanted to be certain. "So many," Scooty repeated, louder this time. "The last census puts Guemes at 10,000 souls," Keel said. This statement surprised him even as it escaped his mouth. Souls. The teachings of ship did come to the surface in a crisis. Keel knew he should assert himself, use the power of his position to demand answers. He owed it to the others, if not to himself. The CP would be after him the minute he returned, for one thing. Rocksack still had family on Guemes, and of this Keel was certain. She would be angry, terribly angry, in spite of her training, and she would be a force to be reckoned with. If I return. Keel felt sickened by the sight on the deck below him. He noted Scooty swiping at her tears. Her eyes were red and swollen. Yes, she had been helping down there, right in the middle of it, during the worst pressures. No need for you to stay here with me, Scooty, Keel said. If they need you down... I've been relieved of duty, she said. She shuddered, but her gaze remained on the receiving area. Keel, too, could not take his attention from that scene of carnage. The receiving area had been cordoned off into sections by color-coded ropes. Emergency medical teams worked throughout the area, bending over pale flesh, moving patients onto litters for transfer. A squad of mermen entered from beneath the platform where Keel stood with Brett and Scooty. The mermen began sorting through the stacks of bodies, opening them to attempt identification. Some of the bags contained only shreds and pieces of flesh and bone. The identification teams moved in a businesslike fashion, but where their jaws were visible, Keel detected clenched muscles. All of them appeared pale, even for mermen. Several of the workers took pictures of faces and identifying marks. Others made notes on a portable translate. Keel recognized the device. Ale had tried to interest his committee in this system, but he had seen it as another way to keep the islands in economic bondage. Everything you write on the transmitter slate is sorted and stored in the computer, Ale had said. Some things are best not recorded, he thought. A man cleared his throat behind Keel. Keel turned to find Lawnfin and another merman standing there. Lawnfin carried a plas box under his left arm. Mr. Justice, Lawnfin said, this is Miller Hastings of Registration. In contrast to the dark, heavy-set Lawnfin, Hastings was a tall, dark-haired man with a thick lower jaw and unwavering blue eyes. Both men wore crisp merman suits of plain gray cloth, the kind of smoothly pressed and well-tended clothing Keel had come to identify with the worst merman officiousness. Hastings had turned his attention to Brett standing a few steps to one side.
We were told we would find a Brett Norton up here, Hastings said. There are just a few formalities. For yourself, too, I'm afraid, Mr. Justice.
Scooty moved behind Keel and took Brett's hand, an action that Keel's wide peripheral vision took in with some surprise. She was clearly frightened. Hastings focused on Keel's mouth.
Our job, Mr. Justice, is to help you adjust to this tragic shit,
Keel said. Brett wondered whether he had heard correctly. The look of surprise on Hastings' face made it apparent that the Chief Justice and Chairman of the Committee on Vital Forms had, indeed, said shit. Brett looked at the Chief Justice's face. Keel had positioned himself with one eye on the two mermen and the other eye still looking down on that bloody deck below them. It was a split of attention that appeared to disconcert the two mermen. Brett found it natural. Everyone knew that some islanders could do this. Hastings made another try.
We know this is difficult, Mr. Justice, but we are prepared for such matters and have developed procedures which
have the decency to leave before I lose my temper, Keel said. His voice betrayed no sign of a quaver. Hastings glanced at the plas box under Lawnfin's arm, then at Brett.
Hostility is an expected reaction, Hastings said, but the sooner we overcome that barrier, the sooner...
I say it plain, Keel said. Leave us. We have nothing to say to you. The mermen exchanged glances. The looks on their faces told Brett that this pair had no intention of leaving.
The young man should speak for himself, Hastings said. His tone was even and cordial. "What do you say, Brett Norton? Just a few formalities."
Brett swallowed. Scooty's hand in his felt slick with perspiration. Her fingers were tense sticks clenched between his own. What was Keel doing? More important, perhaps, could Keel get away with it? Keel was an islander, and a powerful one, someone to admire. This was not the island, however. Brett squared his shoulders in sudden decision.
"Stuff your formalities," he said. "Any decent person would come another time."
Hastings let out a long breath slowly, almost a sigh. His face darkened, and he started to speak, but Keel cut him short. "What the young man is saying," Keel said, "is that it's pretty insensitive of you to come here with your formalities while your cousins stack the bodies of our cousins against that wall down there." The silence between the two groups became stiff. Brett could find no particular familial feeling toward the mangled dead being brought in from the depths, but he decided that the mermen didn't need to know this. Them and us. But there was still Scooty's hand in his. Brett felt that the only merman he could trust might be Scooty, and perhaps that medic in the passageway, Shadow Peniel. Peniel had clear eyes, and he cared.
"We didn't kill those people," Hastings said. "Please note, Mr. Justice, that we have gotten right down to the dirty work of bringing them in, identifying the dead, helping the survivors."
"How noble of you," Keel said. "I was wondering how long it would take to get down to this. You haven't mentioned your fee, of course." Both mermen looked grim, but they did not appear particularly flustered.
"Someone has to pay," Hastings said. "No one topside has the facilities to—"
"So you pick up the dead," Keel said, "and their families topside pay you for your trouble. With a tidy profit for certain contractors, too."
"Nobody expects to work for nothing," Hastings said.
Keel rolled one eye toward Brett, then back. "And when you rescue a live fisherman, you find a way to accommodate him, keeping a close account of the expenses, naturally." "I don't want anything for my part," Scooty said. Her eyes flashed anger at both Keel and Hastings. "I respect that, Scooty," Keel said. "I wasn't indicting you. But your fellow mermen here have a different viewpoint. Brett has no fishing gear to seize, no nets or sonar or beaten-up boat. How will he pay for his life? 10 years of chopping onions in a merman kitchen?"
Hastings said, "Really, Mr. Justice, I don't understand your reluctance to make matters easier."
"I was lured here under false pretenses," Keel said. "I haven't been out of sight of my hosts long enough to spit." He pointed to the viewport across from them. "Look there!" He lowered his pointing finger to indicate the deck below. "Those bodies are shredded, burned, cut to pieces. Guemes was assaulted. I think a reconstruction will show that it was assaulted from below by a hard-shell sub." For the first time, Hastings appeared as though he might lose control. His eyes squinted, and his brows drew down over his beak of a nose. His jaw clenched, and he hissed between his teeth.
"See here, I'm only doing what merman law requires me to do. In my judgment—"
"Oh, please," Keel interrupted. "Judgment is my job, and I'm experienced in it. To me, you look like a pair of leeches. I don't like leeches. Please leave us."
"Since you are who you are," Hastings said, "I will accept that for the moment. This boy, however—"
"Has me here to look out for his interests," Keel said. "This is not the time nor the place for your services." Lonfin stepped to one side, casually blocking the exit passage from the observation platform.
"The boy will answer for himself," Hastings said.
"The Justice asked you to leave,"
Brett said.
Scooty squeezed Brett's hand and said, "Please, I will be responsible for them. Ambassador Ale sent me personally to bring them here. Your presence is disruptive." Hastings looked her in the eyes as though he wanted to say, "Big talk for a little girl," but he swallowed it. His right index finger indicated the Plaz box under Lonfin's arm, then dropped.
Very well, he said. We were trying to smooth out the red tape, but the situation is difficult.
He shot a quick glance at the congested deck below them.
However, I am required to escort you back to Ryan Wang's quarters. It may have been a mistake to bring you here.
I find it agreeable to leave, Keel said. I've seen enough.
His voice was once more smooth and diplomatic. Brett heard the double meaning in Keel's statement and thought,
That old spinneret has a web or two left in him.
The thought stayed with Brett as they returned to Wang's spacious quarters. It had been wise to follow the Chief Justice's lead. Even Scooty had fallen in with Keel. She had kept her hand in Brett's most of the way back to her father's quarters, in spite of disapproving little glances from Hastings and Lonfin. Her hand in his conveyed a feeling of closeness that Brett enjoyed. Once inside the plush room of colored cushions, Keel said, "Thank you, gentlemen. I'm sure we can contact you if you're needed."
You'll hear from us,
Hastings said before he sealed the hatch behind him. Keel crossed to the hatch and pressed the switch, but nothing happened. The hatch stayed sealed. He glanced at Scooty. "Those men worked for my father," she said. "I don't like them." She slipped her hand from Brett's and crossed to a dark red cushion where she sat with her chin on her knees and her arms clasped around her legs. The yellow and green stripes along her single suit curved as she curved. "Brett," Keel said, "I will speak openly, because one of us may be able to get back topside to warn the other islands. My suspicions are being confirmed at every turn. I believe our island way of life is about to be drowned in a shallow sea." Scooty lifted her chin and stared up at him with dismay. Brett could not find his voice. Keel looked down at Scooty, thinking how her pose reminded him of a many-legged mollusk that rolled up into a tight ball when disturbed. "The popular teaching," Keel said, "is that island life is just temporary until we get back to the land."
But Guemes,
Brett said. He could get no further. "Yes, Guemes," Keel said.
No, Scooty blurted. Mermen couldn't have done that. We protect the islands.
"I believe you, Scooty," Keel said. His neck pained him, but he lifted his great head the way he did when passing judgment in his own court. "Things are happening that the people are not aware of, the people topside and the people down under." Scooty asked Keel, "You really think Mermen did this?" "We must reserve judgment until all the evidence is gathered," he said. "Nevertheless, it seems like the most likely possibility." Scooty shook her head. Brett saw sorrow and rejection there.
Mermen wouldn't do such a thing,
she whispered. "It's not the Merman government," Keel said. "Principles of government sometimes take one course while people take another, a political double standard, and perhaps neither really controls events."
What's he saying?
Brett wondered. Keel continued. "Mermen and islanders both have tolerated only the loosest kind of government. I am Chief Justice of a most powerful arm of that government, the one that says whether the newborn of our islands will live or die. It pleases some to call me chairman and others to call me Chief Justice. I do not feel that I dispense justice."
I can't believe anyone would just eliminate the islands,
Scooty said. "Someone certainly eliminated Guemes," Keel said. One sad eye drifted toward Brett, the other remained focused on Scooty. "It should be investigated, don't you think?"
Yes.
She nodded against her knees. "It would be good to have inside help. On the other hand," Keel said, "on the other hand, I would not want to endanger anyone who helped me."
What do you need?
Scooty asked. "Information," he said. "Recent news recordings for the Mermen audience. A survey of Mermen jobs would help. Which categories still have openings, which are filled to overflowing." I need to know what's really happening down here, and we'll need comparable statistics on the islander population that's living down under.
I don't understand,
Scooty said. I'm told you mathematic the waves, Keel said, looking at Brett. I want to mathematic Mermen society. I cannot assume that I'm dealing with traditional Mermen politics. I suspect that even Mermen don't realize they're no longer in the grip of their traditional politics. News is a clue to fluctuations. Jobs, too. They might be a clue to permanent changes and the intent behind those changes.
My father had a com console in his den, Scooty said. I'm sure I could get some of this through it, but I'm not sure I understand how you mathematic it.
Judges are sensitized to the assimilation of data, Keel said. I pride myself on being a good judge. Get me this material if you can.
Brett suggested, maybe we should see other islanders living down under.
Keel smiled. Don't trust the paperwork already, huh? We'll save that for later. It could be dangerous right now. Good instincts, he noted.
Scooty pressed her palms to her temples and closed her eyes. My people don't kill, she said. We aren't like that.
Keel stared down at the girl, thinking suddenly how similar at the core were mermen and islanders. The sea. He had never before thought of the sea in quite this way. How must their ancestors have adapted to it? The sea was always there, interminable. It was a thing unending, a source of life and a threat of death. To Scooty and her people, the sea was a silent pressure, whose sounds were always muted by the depths, whose currents moved in great sweeps along the bottom and through the shadows up to light. For the merman, the world was muted and remote, yet pressing. To an islander, the sea was noisy and immediate in its demands. It required adjustments in balance and consciousness. The result was a quickness about islanders which Mermen found charming. Colorful. Mermen, in contrast, were often studied and careful, measuring out their decisions as though they shaped precious jewels. Keel glanced from Scooty to Brett and back to Scooty. Brett was taken by her, that much was clear. Was it the infatuation of differences? Was he some exotic mammal to her, or a man? Keel hoped something deeper than adolescent sexual attraction had been ignited there. He did not think himself so crass as to believe the islander-merman differences would be solved in the sexual thrashings of the bedroom. But the human race was still alive in these two, and he could feel it moving them. The thought was reassuring.
My father cared for both islanders and mermen, Scooty said. His money made the search and rescue system a system.
Show me his den, Keel said. I would like to use his com console. She stood and crossed to a passage hatch on the far side of the atrium.
This way.
Keel motioned for Brett to stay behind while he followed Scooty. Perhaps if the young woman were away from the distractions of Brett's presence, she might think more clearly, less defensive, more objective. When Keel and Scooty had gone, Brett turned to the locked hatch. He and Keel and Scooty had been sealed away from whatever the exterior merman world might reveal. Ale had wanted them to see that world, but others objected. Brett felt this the complete answer to his present isolation.
What would Queets do? He wondered.
Brett felt it unlikely that Queets would stand vacant-eyed in the middle of a strange room and stare stupidly at a locked hatch. Brett crossed to the hatch and ran a finger around the heavy metal molding that framed the exit.
Should have asked Scooty about communication systems and the ways they move freight, he thought.
He could remember nothing of the passageways except their sparse population, sparse by crowded islander standards.
What are you thinking?
Scooty's voice from close behind him startled him. Brett hadn't heard her approach over the soft carpet.
Do you have a map of this place? He asked.
Somewhere, she said. I'll have to look.
Thanks.
Brett continued to stare at the locked hatch. How had they locked it? He thought of island quarters, where the simplest slash of a knife would let you through the soft organics separating most rooms. Only the laboratories, securities quarters, and Vata's chamber could be said to have substantial resistance to entry, but that was as much a function of the guards as of the thickness of the walls. Scooty returned with a thin stack of overlays on which thick and thin lines with coded symbols indicated the layout of this Mermen complex. She put it into Brett's hands as though giving away something of herself. For no reason he could explain, Brett found her gesture poignant. "Here we are," she said, pointing to a cluster of squares and rectangles marked RW. He studied the overlays. This was not the free-flowing, action-dictated environment of an island, where the idiosyncrasies of organic growth directed the kind of changes that flaunted individuality. Islands were personalized, customized, carved, painted, and dyed, shaped to the synergistic needs of support systems and those the systems supported. The schematic in Brett's hands reeked of uniformity. Identical rows of cubicles, long straight passages, tubing and channels and access tunnels that ran as straight as a sun's rays through dust. He found it difficult to follow such uniformity, but forced his mind to it. Scooty said, "I asked the justice if a volcano might have destroyed Guemes." Brett raised his attention from the schematic.
What did he say?
There were too many people shredded and not burned. She pressed the palms of her hands against her eyelids. Who could do that?
Keel's right about one thing, Brett said. We need to find out who as soon as possible.
He returned his attention to the stack of colloids and its mysterious mazes. All at once he was awash with the simplicity of it. It was clear to him that mermen must find it impossible to travel any island, where sheer memory guided most people. He set about memorizing the schematics, with their lift shafts and transport tubes. He closed his eyes and confidently read the map and displayed itself behind his eyelids. Scooty paced the room behind him. Brett opened his eyes.
Could we escape from here?
He asked, nodding toward the locked hatch. I can get us through the hatch, she said. Where would you go?
Topside.
She looked at the hatch, her head shaking a slow no from side to side. When we open the hatch, they will know. An electronic signal.
What would those men do if we left here together?
Bring us back, she said, or try. The odds favor them. Nothing moves down under without someone knowing. My father had an efficient organization. That's why he hired men like those. She nodded at the hatch. My father directed a very large business, a food business. He had much trade with islanders. Her eyes shifted away from his, then back. She indicated the walls and ceiling. This was his building, the whole thing. As high as the docking tower, all of it. She defined an area on the schematic with a finger. This. Brett drew slightly away from her. She had defined an area as large as some of the smaller islands. Her father had owned it. He knew that by merman law she probably inherited it. She was no simple worker in the seas, an apprentice physicist who mathematiced the waves. Scooty saw the look of withdrawal in his eyes and touched his arm. I live my own life, she said, as my mother did. My father and I hardly knew each other.
Didn't know each other?
Brett felt shocked. He knew himself to be estranged from his own parents, but he had certainly known them. Until shortly before he died, he lived at the Nest, a city about 10 kilometers away, Scooty said. In all that time, I never saw him. She took a deep breath. Before he died, my father came to our room one night and spoke to my mother. I don't know what they said, but she was furious after he left. Brett thought about what she had said. Her father had owned and controlled enormous wealth, much of merman society. Topside, such matters as Ryan Wang controlled were the property of families or associations, never of one person. Community was law. He controlled much of your island's food production, she continued. A flush bloomed across her cheeks, a lot of it accomplished through bribery. I know this because I listened, and sometimes when he was gone I used his console.
What is this place, the Nest?
Brett asked. It is a city that has a high islander population. It was the site of the first settlement after the Clone Wars. You know of this?
Yes, he said. One way or another, we all came from there.
Ward Keel, standing in the shadows of the open passage from Ryan Wang's den, had been listening to this exchange for several minutes. He shuddered, wondering whether he should interrupt and demand some answers of this young woman. The anguish in her voice held Keel in place. "Did those islanders in the nest work for your father?" Keel asked. She didn't turn away from Brett to answer. "Some of them, but no islander has any high position on anything. They are controlled by a government agency. I think Ambassador Ale is in charge of it."
It seems to me that an islander should head an agency that deals with islanders, Brett said.
"She and my father were to be married," Scooty said. "A political matter between the two families. A lot of Mermen history that isn't important now."
Your father and the ambassador, that would have linked the powers of the government and the food supply under one blanket, Brett said.
The insight came so quickly that it startled him. "That's all ancient history," Scooty said. "She'll probably marry Galar Gallo now." Her words came out with an underlying misery that held Brett speechless. He could see the dark confusion in her eyes, the frustration of being a piece in some unruled game. In the shadow of the passage, Ward Keel nodded to himself. He had shuffled back from Wang's den with a feeling of helpless anger. It was all there for the discerning eye, the shifts of control, the quiet and remorseless accumulation of power in a few hands, an increase in local identity. A term from the histories kept rattling in his memory. Nationalization. Why did it give him such a feeling of loss? The land is being restored. The good life is coming. This is why Ship gave Pandora to us. To us, to mermen, not to islanders. Keel's throat pained him when he tried to swallow. The kelp project lay at the base of it all, and that had gone too far to be lost or slowed. It was being taken over instead. Justifications for the project could not be denied. The late Ryan Wang's comm console was full of those justifications. Without the kelp, the suns would continue to fatigue the crust of Pandora. Constant earthquakes and volcanics would ravage them as they had all those generations back. Lava built up undersea plateaus along fault lines. Mermen were taking advantage of this for their project. The last wave wall had been a consequence of a volcanic upheaval, not the gravitational swings that inflicted themselves on Pandora's seas. Brett was speaking.
"I would like to see the nest and the islanders there. Maybe that's where we should go."
Out of the mouths of babes, Keel thought. Scooty shook her head in negation. "They would find us there easily. Security there is not like here. There are badges, papers."
"Then we should run topside," Brett said. "The Justice is right. He wants us to tell the islanders what's happening down here."
"And what is happening?" she asked. Keel stepped out of the shadows, speaking as he moved. "Pandora is being changed. Physically, politically, socially. That's what's happening. The old life will not be possible, topside or down under. I think Scooty's father had a dream of great things, the transformation of Pandora, but someone else has taken it over and is making it a nightmare." Keel stopped, facing the two young people. They stared back at him, aghast. Can they feel it? Keel wondered. Runaway greed was working to seize control of this new Pandora. Scooty jabbed a finger at the schematic, which Brett still held. "The launch base and outpost 22, she said. "Here, they are near Vashon's current drift. The island will be at least a full day past this point by now, but—" "What are you suggesting?" Keel asked. "I think I can get us to outpost 22, she said. "I've worked there. From the outpost I could compute Vashon's exact position." Keel looked at the chart in Brett's hands. A surge of homesickness surged through the Justice. To be in his own quarters. Joy near at hand to care for him. He was going to die soon. How much better to die in familiar surroundings. As quickly as it came, the feeling was suppressed. Escape? He did not have the energy, the swiftness. He could only hold these young people back. But he saw the eagerness in Scooty and the way Brett picked up on it. They might just do it. The islands had to be told what was happening. "Here is what we will do," Keel said, "and this is the message you will carry." Perseverance furthers. The I Ching ship records. Or is it I Ching? It's the letter I, then Ching. I can't remember how that's pronounced. I think I've been told, and I don't know. A flock of wild squawks came flying past the coracles, their wings whistling in the dull gray light of morning. Twisp turned his head to follow the bird's path. They landed about 50 meters ahead of him. Bushka had sat up at the sudden sound, fear obvious in his face. "Just squawks," Twisp said.
Oh,
Bushka subsided with his back against the cuddy.
"If we feed 'em, they'll follow us," Twisp said. "I've never seen 'em this far from an island."
we're near the base," Bushka said.
As they approached the swimming flock, Twisp tipped some of his garbage over the side. The birds came scrambling for the handout. The smaller ones churned their legs so fast they skipped across the water. It was the birds' eyes that interested him, he decided. There was living presence in those eyes you never saw in the eyes of sea creatures. Squawk eyes looked back at you with something of the human world in them. Bushka moved up and sat on the cuddy top to watch the birds and the horizon ahead of them.
Where is that damned launch base?
The motions of the birds kept attracting his attention. Twisp had said the squawks acted out of an ancient instinct. Probably true. Instinct. How long did it take to extinguish instinct? Or develop it? Which way were humans going? How strongly were they driven by such inner forces? Historian questions thronged his mind.
That dull-looking squawk is a female, Bushka said, pointing to the wild flock. I wonder why the males are so much more colorful.
"Has to be some survival in it,"
Twisp said. He looked at the flock swimming beside the coracle, their eyes alert for another handout.
"That's a female, all right."
A scowl settled over his face.
"One thing you can say for that hen squawk, she'll never ask a surgeon to make her normal."
Bushka heard the bitterness and sensed the old familiar islander story. It was getting to be ever more common these days. A lover had surgery to appear Mermen normal, then pressured the partner to do the same. A lot of angry fights resulted.
Sounds like you got burned,
Bushka said.
"I was crisped and charred,"
Twisp said.
"Have to admit it was fun at first."
He hesitated, then,
"But I hoped it would be more than fun, something more permanent."
he shook his head. Bushka yawned and stretched. The wild flock took his movement as a threat and scattered in a flurry of splashes and loud cries. Twisp stared toward the wild birds, but his eyes were not focused on them.
"Her name's Rebecca," he said. "She really liked my arms around her. Never complained about how long they were until—"
He broke off in sudden embarrassment.
She chose surgical correction?
Bushka prompted.
"Yeah,"
Twisp swallowed.
"now what set me talking about Rebecca to this stranger? Am I that lonesome?"
She had liked to feed the squawks at Rimside every evening. He had enjoyed those evenings more than he could tell, and he remembered details in a flood that he shut off as soon as it started. Bushka was staring at his own hands.
She dumped you after the surgery?
"Dumped me? Naw,"
Twisp sighed.
"that would have been easy. I know I'd always feel like some kind of freak around her afterwards. No mute can afford to feel that way, ever. It's why a lot of us more obvious types shy away from the Mermen. It's the stares and the way we think of ourselves then, our own eyes looking back from the mirror.
Where is she now? Bushka asked.
Vashon, Twisp said. Someplace close to center, I'd guess. That's one thing good looks can get you on Vashon. I'd bet big money she's down there where the rich and powerful live. Her job was preparing people psychologically for surgical correction. She was sort of a living model of how life would be if they went through everything right.
She made the choice, and it worked for her.
If you talk about something like that long enough, it becomes an obsession. She used to say, changing some bodies is easy. A good surgeon knows just where to work. Minds are a little tougher. I think she didn't really listen to herself.
Bushka looked at Twisp's long arms, a sudden insight flooding his mind. Twisp saw the direction of Bushka's gaze and nodded.
That's right, he said. She wanted me to get my arms fixed. She didn't understand, not even with all of her psychological crap behind her. I wasn't afraid of the knife or any of that eel shit. It was that my body would be a lie, and I can't stand liars.
This is no ordinary fisherman, Bushka thought.
I finally figured it out about her, Twisp said. A little too much boo, and she started with this pitch for all of us to be as normal as possible. Like you, Bushka.
I don't feel that way.
'Cause you don't have to. You're all ready to join the Mermen on their open land, on their terms.
Bushka found no words to answer. He had always been proud of his Merman normal appearance. He could pass without surgery. Twisp pounded his fist against the rim of the coracle. It startled the caged squawks, who sat up and fluffed their feathers in frustration.
She wanted kids. With me, Twisp said. Can you imagine that? Think of the surprises you'd find in the nursery when all these corrected lying mutes started bedding each other. And what about the kids growing up to find out that they're mutes while their parents appear to be norms? Not for me. His voice was husky. No way.
Twisp fell silent, lost in his own memories. Bushka listened to the slap-slap of waves against the coracle's sides, the faint rustling of the squawks preening and stretching in their cage. He wondered how many love affairs drowned on Wisp's style of principles.
Damn that Jesus Lewis,
Twisp muttered. Bushka nodded to himself.
Yes, that was where the problem had started, or at least where it was precipitated.
The question remained for the historian. What made Jesus Lewis? Bushka looked at Twisp's arms. Muscular, well-developed, tan and over half a length too long. The island mating pool was still a genetic lottery, thanks to Jesus Lewis and his bioengineering experiments.
Twisp was still angry. Mermen will never understand what growing up an islander is like. Someone around you is always frail or dying. Someone close. My little sister was such a nice kid.
Twisp shook his head.
We don't say mutation much except when we're being technical, Bushka prompted. And deformity is a dirty word. Mistakes, that's what we call them.
You know what, Bushka? I deliberately avoid people with long arms. There are only a few of us in this generation. He raised his arm. Are these a mistake? Does that make me a mistake?
Bushka didn't answer.
Damn, Twisp said. My apprentice, Brett, he's sensitive about the size of his eyes. Shit, you can't tell anything just by looking at him, but you can't tell him that. Ship, can't he ever see in the dark? Is that a mistake?
It's a lottery, Bushka said.
Twisp grimaced.
I don't envy the committee's job. You have any idea of the grotesques and the dangerous forms they have to judge? How can they do it? And how can they guess at the mental mistakes? Those don't usually show up until later.
But we have good times, too, Bushka protested. Mermen think our cloth is the best. You know the price we get for islander weaving down under, and our music, our painting, all of our art.
Sure, Twisp sneered. I've heard mermen pawing over our stuff. How bright! Such fun! Oh, isn't this pretty? Islanders are so full of fun.
We are, Bushka muttered.
Twisp merely looked at him for a long time. Bushka wondered if he had committed some unforgivable blunder. Suddenly, Twisp smiled. You're right. Damn! No merman knows how to have a good time the way we do. It's either grief and despair or dancing and singing all night because somebody got married or born or got a new set of drums or hauled in a big catch. Mermen don't celebrate much, I hear. You ever see mermen celebrating?
Never, Bushka admitted.
And he remembered Nakano of Gallo's crew talking about merman life. Work, get a mate, have a couple of kids, work some more and die, Nakano had said. Fun is a coffee break or hauling a sledge to some new outpost. Was that why Nakano had joined Gallo's movement? Precious little fun or excitement down under. Rescue an islander. Work at building a barrier. Bushka did not think of life down under as grim for people like Nakano, just drab. They hadn't the lure of an intellectual goal, nor even the nearness of grief to make them snatch at joy. But topside, there you found a dazzle and color and a great deal of laughter.
If we go back to the open land, it'll be different, Bushka said.
What do you mean, if? Just a few minutes ago you were saying it was inevitable.
There are mermen who want only an undersea empire. If they...
Bushka broke off as Twisp suddenly pointed ahead and blurted, Ship's balls! What is that? Bushka turned and saw, almost directly ahead of them, a gray tower with a lace of white surf at its base. It was like a thick stem to the great flower of sky, a blue flower edged in pink. The storm that had been skirting them for the past few hours framed the scene in a halo of black cloud. The tower, almost the same drab shade as the clouds, climbed up like a great fist out of the depths. Twisp stared in awe. It wasn't visible for 50 clicks, as Bushka had first stated, but it was impressive. Ship! He'd not expected it to be so big. Beyond the gray press of sea and sky, the clouds began to open. The interrupted horizon became two bright flowers, and neither man could take his gaze off the launch tower. It was the center of a giant storm cloud whirlpool.
That's the launch base, Bushka said. That's the heart of the Mermen space program. Every political faction they have will be represented there.
You'd never mistake it for something floating on the surface, Twisp said. No movement at all.
It clears high water by 25 meters, Bushka said. Mermen brag about it. They've only sent up unmanned shots, but things are moving fast. That's why Gallo and his people are acting now. The Mermen expect a manned shot into space soon.
And they control the currents with the kelp? Twisp asked. How?
I don't really know. I've seen where they do it, but I don't understand it.
Twisp looked from the tower to Bushka and back to the tower. The foaming collar of surf around its base had expanded as the coracles drew closer, opening up a wider view. Twisp estimated their distance from the base at more than 5 kilometers, and even from that distance he saw that the surf reached left and right of the tower for several hundred meters on either side. More human activity could be seen there. One of the big merman foils stood off in the calmer water beyond the surf, with smaller craft shuttling back and forth to the tower. A lighter than air hovered nearby, either for observation or use as a sky crane. The coracles were close enough now to make out mermen on the breakwater that fanned out from the base near the tower. The hydrofoil, with its hydrogen ramjets sticking out like big egg sacs astern, drew Twisp's attention. He had seen them only at a distance and in hollows before this. The thing was at least 50 meters long, riding there easily on its flotation hull with the planing foils hidden under water. A wide hatch stood open in its side, with much merman activity around the opening, bulky objects being lowered on an extruded crane. Bushka sat with one arm resting on the cuddy top, his other arm hanging loosely at his side. His head was turned away from Twisp, attention fixed on the launch base and its commanding tower. There was no sign yet that the mermen had taken notice of the approaching coracles, but Twisp knew they had been seen and their course plotted. Bushka's reason for bringing them to this particular place seemed clear, if you believed his story about Gallo. There was little chance that Gallo's people would be the only ones at this base. And there would be mermen attention on every detail of this operation. All factions would hear Bushka's story. Would they believe it?
Have you thought about how they're going to receive you and your story?
Twisp asked.
I don't think my chances are very good, no matter where I turn up, Bushka answered, but better here than anywhere else.
He brought his gaze around to meet Twisp's questioning stare.
I think I'm a dead man any way you look at it, but people have got to know.
Very commendable,
Twisp said. He cut the motor and pulled the tiller into his stomach, holding it there until the two boats circled slowly around each other. Time to apprise Bushka of the facts as Twisp saw them after a night's reflection.
What are you doing?
Bushka demanded. Twisp stretched both arms across the tiller and stared at Bushka.
I came out here to find my apprentice. Kinda stupid of me, I know. I tell you true, I didn't believe there was such a thing as that base, but I thought there would be something, and I came with you because what you said about help from the mermen made sense.
Of course it does. Somebody probably picked him up already, and...
But you're in trouble, Bushka. Deep shit. And I'm in it too, just by being with you. I wouldn't feel right about just dumping you or handing you over to 'em.
He nodded toward the tower.
Especially if your story about this Gallo happens to be true.
If?
Where's the proof?
Bushka tried to swallow. Mermen already would be bringing in the Guemes dead and the survivors. He knew this. There was no turning back. Someone at the launch base already had these coracles and their occupants on a screen. Somebody would be sent to investigate or to warn them off.
What do I do?
Bushka asked.
You sank a whole fucking island.
You sank a whole fucking island, Twisp growled, and you're just now asking yourself this? Sorry. And you're just now asking yourself that? Bushka merely lifted his shoulders and let them fall in a futile shrug.
Guemes must have had small boats out, some inside of the island, Twisp said. There'll be survivors and they'll have their story to tell. Some of them may have seen your sub. You any idea what they'll be reporting?
Bushka cringed under the weight of accusation in Twisp's voice.
You were the pilot, Twisp said. They'll put you through more than this. You did it and they'll get every detail out of you before you talk to anybody outside of Mermen security. If you ever get outside their security.
Bushka lowered his chin to his knees. He felt that he might vomit. With a terrible sense of wonder, he heard coming from his own mouth a groan that pulsed in a rising pitch.
There's nowhere I can run, Bushka thought. Nowhere, nowhere.
Twisp was still speaking to him, but Bushka, lost in his own misery, no longer understood the words. Words could not reach into this place where his consciousness lay. Words were ghosts, things that would haunt him. He no longer felt that he could tolerate such haunting. The thrum of the coracle's little motor being switched on brought Bushka's attention back from its hiding place. He did not dare look up to see where Twisp might be taking them. All of the wheres were bad. It was just a matter of time until someone somewhere killed him. His mind floated on a sea while his muscles pulled him into a tighter and tighter ball so that he might fit into that sea without touching anything there. Voices cried to him, high-pitched screeches. His mind exposed glimpses of a universe fouled by carnage, the shredded island and its broken shards of flesh. Dry heaves shook his body. He sensed movement in the coracle, but only vaguely. Something inside of him had to come out. Hands touched his shoulders and lifted him, laying him over the thwart. A voice said,
"Puke over the side. You'll choke to death in the bilge."
The hands went away, but the voice left one last comment.
"Dumb fuck."
The acid in Bushka's mouth was bitterly demanding, stringy. He tried to speak, but every sound He tried to speak, but every sound felt like sandpaper bobbing in his larynx. He vomited over the side, the smell strong in his nostrils. Presently he dropped a hand into the passing sea and splashed cold salt water over his face. Only then could he sit up and look at Twisp. Bushka felt emptied of everything, all emotion drained.
Where can I go? He asked. What can I tell them?
You tell 'em the truth, Twisp said. Damn it, I never heard of anybody as dumb as you, but I do believe you're a dumb fuck, and I don't think you're a killer.
Thanks,
Bushka managed. What you did, Twisp said. You've marked yourself. No mute will ever get the stares you'll get. You know that? I don't envy you one bit. Twisp nodded toward the tower ahead. Here comes someone to get us. One of their little cargo boats. Ship! I'm done for. I know it.
At any given moment of history is the function At any given moment of history, it is the function of associations of devoted individuals to undertake tasks which clear-sighted people perceive to be necessary, but which nobody else is willing to perform.
A. Huxley, The Doors of Perception, Ship Records. After seeing Scooty expose the master control panel for her father's quarters, find the hatch controls, and trace out the exit hatch circuiting, Brett was ready to believe his new friend a genius. She quickly argued against this when he praised her. "Most of us learn how to do this very young," she giggled. "If your parents tried to lock you in—"
"Why would they lock you in?"
"Punishment," she said. "If we—" She broke off, threw a circuit breaker, and closed the panel cover. "Quick, someone is coming." She leaned close to Brett's ear. "I have set the emergency hatch on manual, and the same with the main hatch. Emergency is the little hatch in the middle of the big one."
"Where do we go when we get out?"
"Remember the plan. We have to leave here before they guess what I've done." Scooty took his hand and hurried Brett out of the service room, down a passage, and into the entry lounge. Hastings and Lawnfin were already there, and involved in a heated conversation with Keel. The Chief Justice raised his voice as Brett and Scooty entered the room.
And furthermore, if you try to blame islanders for the Guemes massacre, I shall demand an immediate committee of investigation, a committee you will not control.
Keel rubbed his eyelids with both hands. The eye looking directly at Hastings focused a hard glare on him. Keel found he enjoyed the small shudder that the man could not hide.
"Mr. Justice," Hastings said, "you are not helping yourself or those youngsters."
He glanced briefly at Brett and Scooty, who had stopped just inside the room. Keel studied Hastings for a moment, thinking how abruptly the mood had turned ugly. Two hatchet men. He passed a glance across Hastings and Lawnfin, noting that they blocked the way to the exit hatch.
I was always told there were no dangerous insects down under, Keel said.
Oh, what a good line that is. What a great line that is. I was always told there were no dangerous insects down under. Keel's great.
I was always told there were no dangerous insects down under, Keel said.
Hastings scowled, but his partner did not change expression.
"This is not a joking matter," Hastings said. "Ambassador Alley has asked us to—"
"Let her tell me herself."
When Hastings did not respond, Keel said, "She lured me down here under false pretenses. She saw to it that I didn't bring any of my own staff. Her stated reason, even as sketchy as that was, does not wash. I have to conclude that I am a prisoner. Do you deny that?" Again he sent a cold gaze across the two men standing between him and the hatch.
Hastings sighed. "You are being protected for your own good. You are an important islander. There has been a crisis."
Protected from whom?
Keel watched Hastings deciding what to say, choosing and discarding alternatives. Several times Hastings started to speak and thought better of it. I can only imagine how awkward that was. Keel rubbed the back of his neck where the prosthetic support already had begun to chafe his neck raw after his brief rest. "Are you protecting me from whomever destroyed Guemes?" he prompted. The two mermen exchanged an unreadable glance. Hastings looked back at Keel.
I would like to be more candid with you, but I can't.
"I already know the structure of what's happening," Keel said. "Very powerful political forces are on a collision course among the mermen."
And topside,
Hastings snapped. "Oh, yes. The two wild cards, my committee and the Faith. Wiping out Guemes was a blow at the Faith, but liquidating me would not deter the committee. They would simply replace me. It's more effective to keep me incommunicado. Or, if I were liquidated, islanders would be distracted enough while selecting a new Chief Justice that mermen could take advantage of the confusion. I no longer think I can stay down here. I am returning topside." Hastings and his companion stiffened.
I am afraid that is impossible just now, Hastings said.
Keel smiled. "Caroline Bluelove will be the next Chief Justice," he said. "You won't have any better luck with her than you have with me." Impasse, Keel thought. A loaded silence fell over the room while Hastings and Longfin studied him. Keel could see Hastings composing new arguments and discarding them. He needed the Chief Justice's cooperation for something. Blind cooperation. He needed agreement without revealing the thing to which Keel must agree. Did Hastings think an old political infighter could not see through this dilemma? Where they stood just inside the room, Scooty and Brett had listened carefully to this argument. Scooty now leaned close to Brett's ear and whispered, "The guest head is that hatch over to the right. Go in there now and open the sealed switch plate by the hatch. Throw a glass of water into the switch. That will short out all the lights in this section. I will unlock the emergency hatch. Can you find it in the dark?" He nodded. "We can be out before they even know we are running," she whispered. "The passageway lights will shine in through the emergency hatch when you open it." "We have to be quick," she said. "They will try to use the main controls. It will be a blink before they realize they'll have to use the manual system." He nodded again. "Follow me and run fast," she said. Where he stood confronting Keel, Hastings had decided to expose part of his knowledge.
Justice Keel, you are wrong about the next Chief Justice, he said. It'll be Simone Rocksack.
"Gillar Gallows' choice?" Keel asked, working from the knowledge he had gained at the late Ryan Wang's comm console. Hastings blinked in surprise. "If so, he's in for another surprise," Keel said. "CPs are notoriously incorruptible."
Your history's slipping, Hastings said. Without the first Pandoran CP, Morgan Oakes, Jesus Lewis would have been just another lab technician.
A solemn expression settled over Keel's face. Petitioners before him on the high bench had seen this look and trembled, but Hastings only stared at him, waiting. "You work for Gallo," Keel said. "Of course you want total political and economic control of Pandora, and you're going to work through the Faith. Did the CP know you were going to destroy her family on Guemes to do it?"
You're wrong. It's not like that.
"Then how is it?" Keel asked.
Please, Mr. Justice, you.
"Someone has latched on to a basic truth," Keel said. "Control the food supply, control the people."
We're running out of time for argument, Hastings said.
"When we actually run out, will I then become one of the Guemes casualties?" Keel asked.
The future of Pandora is at stake, Hastings said. Right-thinking people will steer a safe course through these hard times.
"And for this you will kill anyone who opposes you," Keel said.
We did not destroy Guemes,
Hastings said, spacing out his words in a low, cold voice. "Then how do you know that whoever did it will not turn on you?" Keel demanded.
Who are you to talk about killing? Hastings asked. How many thousands have you destroyed under the authority of your committee? Hundreds of thousands? You've been at it a long time, Mr. Justice.
Keel was momentarily stunned by this attack. But the committee
Does what you tell it to do. The almighty Ward Keel points his finger and death follows. Everybody knows that. What's life to someone like you? How can I expect a mind that alien to understand our Mermen dilemma?
Keel was at a loss how to meet this attack. The accusation stung him. Reverence for life guided his every decision. Lethal deviants had to be weeded out of the gene pool. As Keel stood silently, wondering what might happen next, Brett stepped toward the hatch to the head. Lonfin moved to stand between the hatch and the exit. Brett ignored the man and went into the head, closing the hatch behind him. Brett studied the small room for a moment. The switch plate was a gasketed cover beside the hatch. It had two exposed sealing screws. Brett found the tool Scooty had told him about in the drawer under the sink, a fingernail file. He removed the cover, revealing a paired junction, shiny green and blue conducting plastics. The N and P circuits lay exposed to his view beneath the shielded depressions that changed polarity and activated the switch. "Glass of water," Scooty had said. There was a glass beside the sink. He filled it and, putting one hand on the hatch dog, flung the water at the exposed switch. A blue-green spark flashed up the wall and all the lights went out. In the same moment he opened the hatch and slipped out into darkness. Hastings was shouting,
Get Keel! Hold him!
Brett slipped to his right along the wall and bumped into Scooty at the hatch. She touched his face, then pulled his shoulder close. Abruptly, the little hatch opened, and she was through it, rolling to one side. Brett dove through behind her, and Scooty dogged the little hatch. Leaping to her feet, she darted off down the passage. Brett scrambled up and followed. It was the first time in his life that Brett had run more than 100 meters at one stretch. Scooty was far ahead of him, darting into a side passage. Brett skidded around the corner behind her just in time to see her feet disappear through a tiny round hatch low to the deck. She practically pulled him in behind her as he knelt at the opening. The hatch swung closed and she sealed it in darkness. Brett was panting from the exertion. Sweat stung his eyes.
Where are we?
He whispered. "Service passage for the pneumatic system. Hold on to my waistband and stay close. We have to crawl through the first part." Brett gripped her waistband and found himself almost dragged along a low, narrow passage where his shoulders brushed the sides, and he frequently bumped his head against the ceiling. It was very dim even for him in here, and he was sure she was operating in total darkness. The passage turned left, then right, then sloped upward for a time. Scooty stopped and reached back. She gripped his hand, taking it forward and placing it on a ladder that disappeared somewhere above them. "Ladder," she whispered. "Follow me up." He didn't remind her that he could see.
Where are we going?
"All the way up. Don't slip. It's 21 levels with only 3 ledges to take breaks."
What's up there?
"The docking bay for my father's cargo foils."
Scooty, are you sure you want to do this?
Her voice came to him, small and tightly controlled.
"I won't believe anything without proof, but they're holding the justice and they'd have stopped us. If that's wrong, and it's Ale's doing. The islands should know at least that much."
Right.
She pulled away from him. The slither of her clothing and their breathing were the only sounds. Brett followed her, his hands occasionally touching Scooty's feet on the rungs. The climb felt long to Brett, and he knew it must seem interminable to Scooty, operating in total darkness. He regretted that he had not started counting the rungs. That would help keep his mind off the ever-growing drop to the deck below. It was stomach-tightening for him to think about it, and when he did, his hands didn't want to move from rung to rung. He couldn't see to the bottom or the top, just Scooty's trim form working ahead of him. Once he stopped and looked behind him. Several diameters of pipes were faintly visible to him. One was hot to the touch. There was cold condensation on another. It felt slick when he ran his fingers over it. Algae, he thought. He was thankful for something familiar. There was no such structure or rigidity on an island. Organic conduits grew where they were guided to grow, but guidance had its limits. At the first ledge, Scooty put an arm around his waist and helped him to a place against another ladder. She waited a blink while he caught his breath. Then, "We have to hurry. They may guess where we've gone."
Can they know where we are?
"There are no sensors here, and they won't know I have a key to the service passages."
How did you get it?
"From my father's desk. I found it while showing the justice the den."
Why would your father have had such a key?
"Probably for the same reason we're using it. Emergency escape." She patted his chest gently and turned away. With a sigh, she started on the next stage of their climb. Again, Brett followed. He pressed faster and faster, but she was always farther up, widening the distance between them. Then there was the second ledge, and Brett drew himself onto it, panting. Scooty guided him to the next ladder. When he could control his breathing, he asked,
"How do you move so fast?"
"I run the passageways and work out in the gym," she said. "Those of us who will go back to the open land must be prepared for the demands to be made on our bodies. It will be different from the sea." He knew it was an inadequate response, but all he could manage was,
"Oh."
"Are you rested enough for the last stage?" she asked.
"Lead on."
This time he stayed with her enough that his hand met her foot from time to time. He knew she was setting a slower pace because of him, and this pained him. Still, he was glad for the reserves it might give him. There was still that yawning void below, a place made even more frightening by its drop into a dim void. When he felt the final rung and another ledge, he wrapped an arm around the ladder's vertical supports and drew in deep, gasping breaths. Scooty's hand touched his head. "You all right?"
"Just catching my breath."
She put a hand underneath his right arm.
Come up, I will help. It is safer up here. There is a railing.
With Scooty's hand lifting, Brett crawled over the lip of the ledge. He saw the rail and caught a good grip on it, pulling himself the last few millimeters and then stretching out on the hard metal grate. Scooty rested a hand on his back and, when she felt his breathing smooth out, drew away.
Let's review the plan, she said.
She sat with her back against a metal wall.
"Go ahead,"
he said. He drew himself up beside her, smelling the sweet freshness of her breath, feeling the brush of her hair against his cheek.
The hatch is directly behind me. It's a double hatch. The docking bay is kept under enough pressure to hold a working level on the water. We'll open an alcove off the docking bay. If no one is there, we will just go out and walk normally toward one of the foils. You are my charge, and I am showing you around.
"What if someone sees us coming out of the hatch?"
We laugh and giggle. We are young lovers on a rendezvous. We may get a lecture. If so, we should at least appear to be sorry.
Brett looked at the smooth profile of Scooty's face.
Clever.
Close enough to the truth that he wished it were so.
"Where can we hide in this docking bay?"
he asked.
We won't hide. We will go to one of the foils, one where the operating crew is not aboard. We will escape topside in the foil.
"Can you really operate a foil?"
Of course. I go topside often in the lab foil.
She was all seriousness.
Do you understand what we are going to do?
"Lead the way,"
he said. Scooty slid away from him. There was the slightest sound of metal grating against metal. A small hatch swung wide, letting in dim light. It was bright enough to Brett that he was forced to squint. Scooty slipped out and reached back a hand for him. Brett followed, wriggling through the tight opening. He found himself in a low, rectangular space with gray metal walls. Light came in from a port at the far end. Scooty dogged the hatch behind them, then opened the far hatch. As she had promised, they emerged into a narrow alcove.
Now, she whispered, taking his hand, I am showing you the landing bay and the foils.
She led Brett out onto a narrow platform with a railing and stairs down to a deck about 3 meters below them. Brett stopped and resisted Scooty's attempts to drag him farther. They were under a transparent dome that stretched away from him for several 100 meters.
"Blaz," he thought. "Has to be. Nothing else could take that pressure."
The docking bays were located inside this gigantic inverted cup that held out the sea. A Plaz umbrella. He looked up at the surface, no more than 50 meters away, a milky silver region with the doubled shafts of light indicating that both suns stood above the horizon. Scooty tugged at his arm. Brett looked down to the deck, a giant metal grate with piers stretching out at the far side toward the descending lip of the facility's plaz cover. As he watched, a submerged foil cruised under the far lip and lifted into the bay with a cascade of water off its hull. The foil slid into an empty bay, its engines a painful growl in his ears even at this low speed. With the newcomer, Brett counted 6 of the huge boats lined up in a row. Mermen worked busily around them on the piers, securing the lines of the new arrival, wheeling cargo on carts to and from the open hatches in the line of craft. "They're so big," Brett said, craning his neck at the prow of the foil directly ahead of them. Someone was working up there, dreamily scraping a dry skin of green kelp off of the extruded fenders. "Come along, come along," she said, her voice slightly louder than conversation required. "I'll take you aboard one of them. Kareen wants you to see it all." This, Brett realized, was for the benefit of a merman who had stopped below them and was watching them with a questioning tilt to his head. As Scooty spoke, he smiled and strode away. Brett allowed her to lead him down the stairs. "Food transport uses only the 70-meter cargo model," she said. "In spite of their size, they'll do at least 80 knots. Somewhat slower in heavy seas. I'm told they can top 100 knots with a light load." Her hand in his, Scooty guided Brett down the line of foils, weaving in and out of the passing workers and stepping aside for loaded carts. At the end, they met 6 white-uniformed workers wheeling a covered cart toward them along the pier. "Repair crew," Scooty explained. She spoke to the first man in the group. "Something wrong with this one?"
Just a little trouble with the thrust reverser, Miss Wang."
All 6 stopped while the leader spoke to Scooty. They all looked very much alike in their white coveralls. Brett saw no name tags. "Can I take our guest aboard to show him around? I'm familiar with this one," she said. Brett thought he detected a note of false petulance in her voice.
"I'm sure you are," the crewman said, "but be careful. They've just finished refueling it for the test run. You'll have to be out in about an hour. The next shift will be loading it then."
"Oh, good," Scooty said, dragging Brett around the repair cart. "We'll have it all to ourselves, and I can show you everything." She called back over her shoulder, "Thanks." The crewman waved and helped his men trundle their cart down the pier. Midway down the hull, Scooty led the way up a narrow gangplank. Brett followed her into a passage, lighted by overhead tubes. She motioned for him to wait while she peered back out the open hatch. Presently she pressed a switch beside the hatch. A low hum sounded and the gangplank slid in. The hatch sealed behind it with a soft hiss. "Quick!" she said. She turned, and once more they were running. Scooty led him up a series of gangways and along a wide corridor, emerging finally into a plaz-windowed control room high above the prow. "Take the other seat." She slid into one of the 2 command couches that faced a bank of instruments. "I'll show you how to run one of these things. It's really simple." Brett watched her, seeing the way she became another person as she touched the controls. Every movement was quick and sure. "Now this one," she said, hitting a yellow button. A low thrumming could be felt through the deck under their feet. Several mermen working on the pier below them turned and looked at the foil. Scooty moved her hand up to a red button labeled Emergency Release, Docking Lines. She touched the button and immediately drew a lever at her left all the way back. The foil slid smoothly out of its dock. Mermen below them began to run and wave at the foil. Before they cleared the dock, Scooty began pumping ballast aboard. The foil slipped under the water, banking sharply to the left. Scooty lifted a stick from the deck beside her. Brett saw that it was socketed into the deck and wondered what it controlled. Her left hand moved the lever on the other side of her, throwing it full forward. The foil dove toward the lip of the inverted plaz cup. Brett looked up as they passed under the lip, watching the lighted edge pass away astern. Once on the other side, Scooty began blowing ballast as she lifted the bow toward the surface. Brett swiveled around and saw the docking bay recede behind them. There was no pursuit yet. Brett was stunned at the size of the boat.
70 meters. That's 10 coracles long.
Watch what I'm doing, Scooty ordered. You might have to run one of these things. Brett turned back to take in the levers, buttons, gauges, and switches. Hydrogen ramjets for both underwater and surface, she said. Fuel conservation system reduces our speed underwater. Here's the governor. She indicated a clip-locked toggle between them. Dangerous to exceed governed speed, but it can be done in an emergency. She moved the stick in her right hand, swinging it to starboard and pulling back on it slightly. This steers us, she said. Pull back to lift, down to dive. Brett nodded. These, she indicated a bank of instruments across the top of the board. You read the labels. Topside fuel flow, ballast, slower than on a sub. Ignition, air supply for down under. Always remember to switch it off topside. If the cockpit is breached, we're automatically ejected. Manual ejection is by that red lever at the center. Brett responded with a series of grunts or got it. He was thankful that all the switches and instruments carried clear labels. Scooty pointed overhead where a black hood framed a large gridded screen. Charts are projected there. That's something islanders have been trying to get for a long time.
Why can't we have it?
Brett knew the system she had indicated. Fishermen grouched about it often. Steeran, the Mermen called it. A navigation system that worked by reading Mermen fixed underwater transmission stations. Too complicated and too costly for upkeep. You just don't have the support facilities. He had heard that story before. Islanders didn't believe it, but Scooty obviously did. Topside, she announced. The foil broke the surface in a long wave trough that crested under them. Water cascaded off the plaz all around. Brett clapped his hands over his eyes. The stabbing blast of light made his eyeballs feel like two hot coals in his head. He ducked his face down onto his knees with a loud moan. Is something wrong? Scooty asked. She did not look at him, but busied herself dropping the foils from their hull slots and increasing speed.
It's my eyes,
he said. He blinked them open, adjusting slowly. Tears washed over his cheeks.
It's getting better.
Good, she said. You should watch what I do. It's best to put the foil up on the step parallel to the waves, then quarter into them as you bring it up to speed. I'll get the course in a blink after we're at cruise. Look back and see if there's any pursuit. Brett turned and stared back along their wake, aware suddenly of how fast they were already moving. The big foil throbbed and bounced under them. Then suddenly the ride smoothed, and there was only the high whine of the hydrogen rams and the jumping jostle of the foils bridging the waves. 85 knots, Scooty said. Are they after us yet?
I don't see anything.
Brett wiped at his eyes. The pain was almost gone. I don't see anything on the instruments, she said. They must know it's hopeless. Every other foil in the bay has at least some cargo aboard. We have none and have full fuel tanks. Brett returned his attention to the front, blinking away the pain as his eyes reacted to the sunlight off the waves. The RDF is over to your right, that green panel, she said. See if you can raise Vachon's signal. Brett turned to the radio direction finder, which is what RDF stands for. He saw at once it was a more sophisticated model than the one on which Twisp had trained him, but the dials were labeled and the frequency arc was immediately identifiable. He had the signal in a moment. The familiar voice of Vachon's transmission to its fishing fleet crackled from the overhead speakers.
It's a good fishing day, everyone, and big cargoes expected. Murray, you're running strong in Quadrant 19.
Brett turned down the volume. What is Quadrant 19? Scooty asked.
It's a grid position relative to Vachon.
But the island moves as it drifts.
So do the Murray, and that's all that's important.
Brett twisted the dials, homed in on the signal, and read the coordinates.
There's your course, he said, pointing to the dial above the RDF. Is that sun relative or compass?
Compass.
Doppler distance reads 590 clicks. That's a long way.
7+ hours, she said. We can run 10 hours without stopping to recharge fuel. We can regenerate our own hydrogen from seawater during daylight hours, but we'll be sitting squawks if they come after us or try to block us from some station up ahead.
They could do that?
I'm sure they'll try. There are 4 outposts along our course.
We would need more fuel,
He said, and they'll be looking for us from down under.
What about one of the smaller islands?
I saw the latest plot on the current board yesterday. Vashon's closest by more than 500 clicks.
Why can't I get on the emergency frequency and tell Vashon what we know? We should report in anyway, he added.
What do we know? She asked, adjusting the throttle. The foil lurched slightly and tipped, climbing one of the periodic high waves.
We know they're holding the Chief Justice against his will. We know there are a lot of dead islanders.
What about his suspicions?
They're his suspicions, Brett said, but don't you think he deserves a hearing?
If he's right, have you thought about what may happen if the islands try to force his return? Brett felt a lump in his throat.
Would they kill him?
Somewhere there seem to be people who kill, she said. Guemes proves that.
Ambassador Ale?
It occurs to me, Brett, that Hastings and Lawnfin may be watching her to see what she does. Whoops. It occurs to me, Brett, that Hastings and Lawnfin may be watching her to see that she does not do something dangerous to them. My father was very rich. He warned me often that this created danger for everyone around him.
I could just call in and tell Vashon I'm safe and returning, he said.
He shook his head.
No, to those that listen in,
And they are listening, she added.
it would be the same thing as just spilling the story right now, he said. What'll we do?
We will go to launch base, she said, not to outpost 22.
But you told Justice Keel,
And if they force him to talk, they will look for us in the wrong place.
why the launch base?
He asked. No single group controls that, she said. That's a part of all our dreams. Get the hype tanks down from where ship left them in orbit.
It's still a Mermen project.
It is all Mermen. We will say our piece there. Everyone will hear it. Then all will know what a few people may be doing. Brett stared straight ahead. He knew he should feel elation at their escape. He was in the biggest vessel he had ever seen, rocketing along the wave tops at more than 80 knots, faster than he had ever gone before. But unknowns crowded in on him. Keel did not trust the Mermen, and Scooty was Merman. Was she being honest? Had he heard her real reasons for wanting him to avoid the radio? He looked at Scooty. For what other reason could she help him escape? I've been thinking, Scooty said. If no word has reached them, your family will be sick with worry about you. And your friend, Twisp. Call Vashon. We'll make do. Maybe my suspicions are foolish. He saw her throat pulse with a swallow, and he remembered her tears over the heaped bodies of the islanders.
No, he said, we should go to your launch base.
Again, Brett concentrated on the sea ahead of them. The two suns lifted heat shimmers off the water. When he had been much younger, seeing the island rim for the first time, the heat shimmers had created images for him. Long whiskered sea dragons coiled above the ocean's surface, giant murri and fat scrubberfish. The shimmer play now was nothing but heat reflected off water. He felt the warmth on his face and hands. He thought of Twisp leaning back against the coracle's tiller, eyes closed, soaking up the heat through his hairy chest.
Where is this base?
He asked. She reached up and turned a small dial below the overhead screen. Beside the dial, an alphanumeric keyboard glowed with its own internal lights. She typed HF-I, then LB-1. The screen flashed 141.2, then overprinted a spray of lines with a common focal point. A bright green spot danced at the wide outer arc of the lines. Scooty pointed at the spot. That's us. She pointed to the base of the spray. We go here on course 141.2. She pointed to a dial with a red arrow on the console in front of them. The arrow indicated 141.2.
That's all there is to it?
All? Scooty smiled. There are hundreds of transmitter stations all around Pandora, a whole manufacturing and servicing complex, all to ensure that we get from here to there. Brett looked up at the screen. The spray of lines had pivoted until the bright green dot lay centered on course. The 141.2 still glowed in the lower left corner of the screen. If we require course change, it will sound a klaxon and show the new numbers, she said. Steer and homing on LB1. Brett looked out across the water beside them, seeing the spray kicked up by the foils, thinking how valuable such a system would be to Vashon's fishing fleet. The sun burned hot on him through the plas, but the air felt good. Rich topside air blew in the vents. Scooty Wang was at his side, and suddenly Pandora didn't seem to be the adversary that he'd always imagined. Even if it was a deadly place, it had its measure of beauty. Now, this book was published in 1983. I'm trying to remember when the first hints of a global positioning system, GPS, really started to come into their own. The next chapter is a short one. Let me really quick look up when GPS was first being put into practice. I think it had started by then. GPS. Global Positioning System. When did it start? Yeah, it had started in 78, so this was using very current ideas at the time. So I was gonna say, if it had been like the early 70s, I would have been like, oh wow, this is ahead of its time. But I was like, it might have been there by the 80s, and it was. So a pretty good realization of the practical upshots of the GPS system, though. Stuff that we take for granted now.
One measure of humanity lies in the lengths taken to right the wrongs perpetrated against others. Recognition of wrongdoing is the first crucial step.
Raja Thomas, The Journals. Shadow Peniel covered the dead mute. He washed his hands in the alcohol basin beside the litter. The rest of the room bustled with the clink of steel instruments against trays. Low-voiced, one-word commands and grunts came from several busy groups of doctors and med-techs. Peniel looked back over his shoulder at the long row of litters strung down the center of the room, each one surrounded by medics. Splashes and blotches of blood stained gray gowns, and the eyes above the antiseptic masks looked more tired, more hopeless every hour. Of all the survivors brought in by the pickup teams, only 2 had escaped physical harm. Peniel reminded himself that there were other kinds of harm. What the experience had done to their minds, he hesitated to think of them as survivors. The mute behind Peniel had died under the knife for lack of replacement blood. The medical facility had been unprepared for bleeders on such a tremendous scale. He heard Karine Ale snap off her gloves behind him. "Thanks for the assist," she said. "Too bad he didn't make it. This was a close one." Peniel watched one of the teams lift a litter and carry it toward the recovery area. At least a few would make it. And one of his men had said they were herding together the few fishing boats that had escaped and fled the drift. Peniel rubbed his eyes and was immediately sorry. They burned from the touch of alcohol and started streaming tears. Ow. Ale took him by the shoulder and led him to the sink beside the hatchway. It had a tall, curved spout that he could get his head under. "Let the water run over the eyes," she said. "Blinking helps the rinse." "Thanks." She handed him a towel. "Relax," she said. "That's the last of them." "How long have we been at it?" 26 hours. "How many made it?" "Not counting those in shock, we have 90 still breathing in recovery. Several hundred with only minor injuries. I don't know. Fewer than 1,000 anyway, and 6 still under the knife here. Do you believe what this one told us?" "About the sub? It's hard to write it off to hallucinations or delirium, considering the circumstances." He was clear-headed when they brought him in. Did you see what he managed to do with his legs? It's too bad he didn't make it. It's too bad he didn't make it. He tried harder than most people.
Both legs severed below the knees, and he managed to stop the bleeding himself, Peniel said. I don't know, Karine. I guess I don't want to believe him, but I do.
What about the part about the sub rolling upside down before its dive? Ale said. Couldn't that mean somebody just lost control of the machine? Surely no merman would do something like that deliberately.
That patient, Peniel waved towards the litter behind them, claimed that a merman sub deliberately sank their island. He said he saw the whole thing. The sub came directly up through their center and...
It was an islander sub, she insisted. Must have been.
But he said... Karine inhaled deeply and sighed.
He was mistaken, my dear, she said. And to avoid serious trouble, we'll have to prove it.
They both stepped aside as two attendants carried the litter with the dead mute out the hatchway, bound for the mortuary. Karine began to recite what Peniel knew would become the Mermen line.
He was a mute. Mutes don't have all of their faculties, even under the best of circumstances.
You've been spending too much time with Gallo, Peniel said.
But look at what we had to work with here, she said.
Her voice bordered on a whisper. Peniel didn't like it, nor did he like the turn of conversation. Frustration and fatigue brought out a side of Karine Ale that he had not known existed.
Missing parts, extra parts, misplaced parts.
She gestured with a whimsical wave of her hand.
What their medical people do for an anatomy class boggles the mind. No, Shadow, it must have been an islander sub. Some interior score they were settling. What could any of us gain by such an act? Nothing. I say we should have a drink. Just have a drink and forget it. How about it?
What he described was not an islander sub, Peniel insisted. What he described was a kelp sub with cutters and welders. Karine pulled him aside as a mother might take a troublesome child aside during worship.
Shadow, you're not making sense. If mermen sank that island, then why go to all the trouble to man the pickup teams? Why not just let them go? No, we worked hard here to save what we could. Not that it mattered.
What do you mean, not that it mattered?
You saw them, their condition. The best of them were starving. Leather on bone. They looked like furniture.
Then we should feed them, Peniel said. Ryan Wang didn't develop the largest food distribution in history just to let people starve.
Feeding them's a lot easier than hauling them in dead, she said.
These are people, Peniel snapped. Ale's quick eyes flicked from Peniel around the room to the surgical and trauma teams, then back. Her lips were trembling, and he saw with surprise that she was only barely under control. That patient may have been a mute, but he was no fool, Peniel insisted. He reported what he observed, and he did it clearly.
I don't want to believe him,
Ale said. But you do. Peniel put an arm around her shoulders.
Ale trembled at his touch. We must talk, she said. Would you go back to my quarters with me?
They rode the tubes, Ale's head lolling on his shoulder. She snored a little, caught herself, and settled closer against him. He liked the feeling of her warmth soaking into him. When their car started into a curve, he held her shoulder a little tighter to keep the movement from waking her, giving himself time to think. Karine wanted to talk. Did she want to persuade? How would she argue? With her body? Peniel decided this thought was unworthy of him. He rejected it. 26 hours in surgery, he thought. Soon Ale would face the difficult politics that the surgery represented. He had noticed the deepening circles of sleepless nights settling under Ale's beautiful eyes. Peniel was glad for one aspect of the surgery. It brought out the doctor in Ale, a part of her personality that had become more ghost-like during her brief association with Ryan Wang. Though she'd been alert and awake during the whole frustrating business with the Guemes Islanders, Ale had fallen asleep almost before the transport hatch closed on them. As the islanders died under the knife, one by one, he had watched her blue eyes darken over her mask.
They're so frail, she had said, so poor. The replacement blood had run out in 2 hours. Plasma and oxygen were gone in 16. Surgical supervisors suggested sterilizing seawater and using that for plasma, but Ale refused. Stick with what we know, she said. This is not the time for experimentation. In her sleep, Ale's hand reached around Peniel's waist and pulled him closer. Her hair smelled of antiseptics and perspiration, but he found the mixture comforting because it was her. He liked the brush of her hair against his bare neck. The hours of sweat in his own hair made him glad he'd kept it braided. He ached for a shower even more than he ached for a bed. Peniel caught himself dozing off just as they jerked to a stop. The panel above their heads flashed the message, Organization and Distribution. Garine, he said, we're here. She sighed and squeezed his waist tighter. He pressed the hold button on the panel with his free hand. Garine? Another sigh. I heard you, Shadow. I'm so tired. We've arrived, he said. You'll be more comfortable inside. She looked up at him, but didn't move away. Her eyes were red and puffy from lack of sleep, but she managed to smile. I just got acquainted with you, she said. I thought I knew you, but now I'm not letting you out of my sight. He placed a finger against her lips. I'll just take you to our quarters. We can talk later. What makes this mysterious Shadow Peniel tick? She asked in a whisper. Then she kissed him. It was a brief kiss, but warm and powerful. You don't mind, do you? She asked. What about Gallo? Well, she said, the sooner we get out of here, the sooner life goes on. They uncurled themselves from each other. He liked the way the warm spots lingered and tingled on his skin. Ale stepped out of the hatch onto the docking bay and reached back a slender hand to pull him through. You're beautiful, he said, and her strong grip pulled him right up to her. Then she hugged him close. Again he put down his doubts about her. You have a way with words, she said. Runs in my family. You could have been a surgeon, she said. You have good hands. I'd like to spend more time studying your hands. I'd like that, he murmured against her hair. I've always wanted to know you better. You know that. I have to warn you, I snore. Unnoticed, he said. They held each other and swayed on the docking bay. You drool, too, he said. Don't be crude. She pinched him in the ribs. Ladies don't drool. What's this wet spot on my shoulder? How embarrassing, she said. Then she took his hand and guided him up the walkway toward her building. She glanced back at him and said, Nobody lives long enough for dilly-dallying. Let's get to it. Peniel realized right then that the pace of his life had just turned itself up a full notch. Tired as he had been, he sparked with the measure of energy that she injected into the air around them. There was a new bounce to her step that he hadn't noticed in surgery. Her body moved smoothly, quickly across the black-tiled foyer, and he matched her step for step. When they walked into the ambassadorial quarters, they were still holding hands. Ow, ow! And stuff. How long is this next chapter? What time is it? It's long. It's pretty long. The chapter after that is only 1 page long, though, which is kind of embarrassing. Not embarrassing, frustrating. Whatever. Let's see what we'll do for next week's segment. I could do that, yeah. Yeah, that's probably good. Okay.
So yeah, that'll do it for this week. Hopefully people enjoyed. I do like how a lot of the relationships in this seem at least somewhat reasonable and adult. It's not like, ooh, constant horniness. It's like, oh, they've got issues. It's not super lascivious. There's a bit more sex in our future. It's also part of the human condition. So, to all the prudes out there, sorry, it's a thing we do. It's a compulsion even of our carbon-based life form to keep making more of ourselves. At any rate, that'll do it for this week. Next week we will be reading more of that. Probably got, looking at it again, maybe 3 shortish streams or 2 really long ones. I'm not sure yet. Oh no. Yeah. Sorry, 3 shortish streams or 3 medium-sized streams or 4 short ones. There we go. I know math. But yeah, hopefully people are enjoying it. I think it's pretty good. The pace is ratcheting up pretty steadily and quickly. I think next week or the week after, we're going to have a wait, what moment where it kind of skips ahead a bit and then kind of rewinds a ways afterward to explain how we got to the thing we skipped ahead to. Um, it does that. It might do it again after that. I seem to recall there's 2, maybe 3 of those instances, but there's a pretty drastic one coming up pretty soon. Very noticeable that threw me when I was rereading it in preparation for reading this aloud. I was like, oh, I don't remember that. Um, I was shocked at how little about the book I did remember. Still very good though. Yeah. So uh, next Monday we'll be reading. This coming Monday rather, we'll be reading. I think it's the last chunk. Yeah, the last part of book 2. Oh no, I'm gonna have to split that in half. There's no way. That is way too long. I'm gonna be tapped Monday. Um, we'll see what happens on Monday. I'd like to read through the whole rest of book 2 of Full Metal Panic, but we'll see. Music recommendation of the week. Let's see. Ooh, I do have one actually. Thank you for asking, Fritz on Tap. Music recommendation of the week. I am going to recommend this one. I can do. An artist named Alphonse Mouzon, spelled here. I'll type it out. Alphonse Mouzon Virtue. Highly recommend Alphonse Mouzon in general. He's a brilliant artist. I want to say he's a drummer, but he doesn't just play drums. He does other things as well. I cannot for the life of me remember offhand the album I first listened to that he was on. It wasn't, he was not the artist listed, but he was on it. Um, oh, what was it called? I cannot remember offhand. I'm sorry. Uh, it was with, I think, Sonny Rollins and a couple other people. But highly recommend. Very, I don't even know how I would describe it, to be honest. So he was prolific during the 70s and 80s. So I guess I'd call it like, it's sort of fusiony, jazz funk fusion, and also just kind of funk. It's really good. It's a really good album. I recommend it. I wish I could, if I could remember the album that I had first heard him on and then saw his name for like, oh, this is an Alphonse Mouzon specific album, um, and grabbed it. I was like, oh, let's go. Um, I would tell you that other one as well, but I can't remember it offhand. Um, Possibly he was with Felix Martin as well. I'm not sure. Definitely, I'm confident it was him and Sonny Rollins. I could probably find this out. Let's Discogs this. Alphonse Mouzon. What do we got? Who did he work with? That's not telling me anything useful there. Let's sort through. Yes, I think those would definitely work. I don't know if any of that's on YouTube. It might be. Ah, here we go. Oh, he worked with Herbie Hancock as well. Cool. I know he was in a bunch of like bands with just like wild people in them. Really talented individuals, uh, including the one that I had found, and I can't remember the title of. So yeah, do recommend. But yeah, hopefully Monday we'll get through the last portion of Full Metal Panic. We might not. I'd like to. Next Wednesday, still tentatively on course for starting Down Below Station, which will take us a little while to get through. It's a fairly chunky tome. Um, After that, I don't know that it'll go straight. Well, so the bare minimum I need to do to get us prepped for Cytine and Regenesis is down below, in my opinion, is Down Below Station and 40,000 at Gehenna. 40,000 at Gehenna is really short. That's probably maybe 4 installments at most. It might even be less. Um, there's a bunch of stuff that's adjacent to that happens shortly around the time period that events wise in universe that Down Below Station happens that I kind of want to read aloud though because they're fun. They're just fun to read. Um, Rim Runners is one of them. Merchanter's Luck is another. Those are probably two of the bigger ones. Tripoint will make its own thing. Tripoint's kind of a lot happens in Tripoint. There's a lot that goes down in Tripoint. Um, that I can remember like half of that book at any given time. There's a lot that goes on there. Um, Down Below Station is much the same way. So tentatively, we're still on schedule for doing that. If I change my mood, I might not do that, but I hope to. Um, so call it like 3 or 4 books is probably what I want to get through by C.J. Sherry before I do Cytine. And Cytine is really long, and that'll take us a while to get through. So maybe at the end of this year, depending on how long it takes me to get stuff done. Maybe, maybe we'll see. And then Fridays, we'll keep doing Lazarus Effect until we're done with that. Once we are done with the Lazarus Effect, however, we will move on to the third and final, really final, by the original author, volume of the Three Body Problem trilogy, or Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy, which is entitled Death's End. So we will get onto that after we're done the Lazarus Effect. After we finish Death's End, we will, which is by Shijin Liu. Chinese author. When we finish Death's End, we will then read the final volume in the Pandora sequence entitled The Ascension Factor. Um, and then I'll be ready to do. Fridays will be open for whatever I want to do on Friday. Probably I'll do something by Greg Egan as a palate cleanser. We're starting to get into really weird Greg Egan territory. Like he starts early and then it gets weirder. What's the next novel I have that I haven't read chronologically? Might be Tyrannesia. No, it's Did I do Shield? No, I didn't do Shield's Letter. I did Permutation City was the last one I did. So Distress, I think, chronologically as an author would be the next one. I have done the short story collections all out of order. Those are all throughout his career. There's 1 or 2 of the short story collections that I haven't read aloud here yet, um, including Phoresis and Sleep and the Soul. Um, those are relatively short story collections. The stories in them are quite long. Let me check real quick to see if he's come out with anything more recent. GregEgan.net. Looks like Morphotrophic is still the most recent one from 2024. I haven't actually gotten around to reading Morphotrophic. I need to do that, as well as Scale from 2023. Someday. Soon. This year, I will get around to reading those. I did read The Book of All Skies, which was a lot of fun. There's a lot going on there. Pretty wild ideas. Anyway, that has us pretty well set, I think, for status quo. Either this weekend or next weekend, I'll get the playlists updated so that those are up to date, which will include all of the absolution stuff in one playlist. I can throw that into the Area X playlist as well, or Southern Reach trilogy playlist as well. I'll throw that at the end, um, for giggles, even though it stands on its own fairly well. But yeah, hopefully nothing. I'm gonna make it happen eventually. So yeah, that's it for this week. I'm glad people tuned in. If anybody didn't tune in, that's okay. If you're listening to this after the fact, at some unknown future date, possibly it's even me listening to it, which is not something I tend to do too often. But yeah, if you want to tune in live, you can. I do these live every Monday, Wednesday, and a Friday, starting at 12 noon ish, U.S. East Coast time, or Eastern Standard Time, or UTC -5, whichever one is easier for you to work with and translate from. I realize this is not an ideal time for nearly anyone unless you're like 6 hours on either side of that. If you're across the sea, it's the evening, so it's probably dinner time for you, or later. If it is on the other side of the coast, if it's on the if it's on the West Coast U.S., it's early in the morning for you, and you're probably either just getting into work or something else, or not awake yet. If you're on the East Coast, it's maybe your lunch break. You can tune in for a little bit. So I understand. I understand that's difficult. If you're in Australia, it's like 12 to 13 hours different. So it's middle of the night for you. Um, at any rate, I realize it's not an ideal time, but it works for me because I'm able to fit it in then. Um, Plus, I don't expect people to tune in live. If they do, it's cool. If they don't, that's fine. Just listen to them after the fact. I'm not picky or particular. Um, yep. I haven't checked my comments in a minute. Oh, I don't need to open up a remote desktop connection. What am I doing? Ah, I think the last one I had was. Oh, we got a couple in. Let's see. What do we got? Heath Harris says on a starfish stream. Nice. They're going through my stuff. I'll take noisily mic'd humanity over an AI voice any day or night. Thanks for your time and effort. Thank you for tuning in. Heath Harris also says 0.75x time speed for the win. Sleepy Time Brain is a slow boy. And then Josh Kerr says at 2 hours and 15 minutes on one of the Absolution streams, I can't tell which one, part 8. They love that commenter's theory, but I'd lean towards that being a doppelganger of control, one who's retained sovereignty over themselves like the biologist, if only because I'm pretty sure the ending of Acceptance is control being transformed into a rabbit, and I like the idea of him being the solo one spotted by the mutter. Ooh, I do like that idea. I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of that. That's a good one. I'm not sure what's going on with the rabbits. Like every time I think I have an idea as to what's going on in with the rabbits in Absolution, I'm not sure anymore. It's something to do with the fact that it is like a weird recursive, ever expanding, bootstrapped time loop or something. Maybe, possibly. So like Area X might be getting different ideas from alternative time streams or something, and they get spewed forth elsewhere after being tweaked. But they could also be something sent from the future by the people that sent future Rogue Whitby. So they could be like a Rogue Whitby thing because he was feeding the rabbit camera oyster insides to the tyrant. I'm not really sure what's going on there. We need a fifth book, is what I'm saying, in order to answer any questions. But you just know he'll bring up even more questions than answers. For everything he answers, he will add more questions. Anyway, good times. I should start making that a thing as I just go over like comments that I receive through the week and respond to them. I should probably do that more often. Anyway, I don't want to make it too parasocial, even though I've got a Discord channel for people who want to chat. Um, just because, like, I've read horror stories, but I am not planning on letting the weird stuff happen. It's like respectful distance. I'm literally just a hallucinatory voice that you hear over the internet, and you all are hallucinatory text that I see over the internet. So who knows how real any of us are? I don't know. So anyway, that's enough of a ramble for now. I'll see you all later. Stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other, and I'll see you all next time. Toodaloo!